Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on the Black Rock Castle Observatory YouTube channel. Today, we are celebrating all things science because we are right in the middle of Science Week. And of course, we here at the observatory are obviously going to be approaching this week from the space angle. So if you like what you're seeing here today, give us a big like. And if it's your first time joining us, be sure to subscribe to our channel because we do things like this quite often and we put up new content. So if you subscribe, then you won't miss out on the latest posts and live streams like this one. So we're live right now. And if you're joining us on the YouTube channel, you can drop us a comment in the comment section, or there's a live chat going and we'll be looking at those comments and questions there. We'll be able to address any of the questions that you have for us during our discussion today. So let's get straight into it because we have a lot to talk about and I am really excited about this topic. Before we get into it though, I want to introduce our panel. We have Niall, Francis, Rob, and myself, Danielle from Black Rock Castle Observatory, and we are all part of the SciComm team here. And we are really excited to talk about astronauts. It's a big part of what we do here and a big part of the space industry and space in general and a big part of space careers. And this year in particular, there have been a lot of launches happening lately and a lot of people going to space, and we're seeing different types of people going into space. So we want to talk a little bit about what it means to be an astronaut and the title astronaut. So I'd like to start us out because you guys here know I've got a language background and I love the term astronaut. Absolutely love that it comes from Greek. Astro means star and naut is sailor. So I just love that it's a sailor amongst the stars. Like that's just such a cool thing. So that's the original definition, right? It doesn't get more original than that. That's our baseline definition of an astronaut. But like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of different types of people going into space. And first and foremost, I want to know, has everyone here seen the private launches that have been happening over the summer? We've all seen them. Rob,
watch them on the telly. Haven't taken a trip out to see a launch, but watch bits of them on the telly.
Yeah. Now, has anyone ever seen a live launch?
I haven't.
No, I haven't either. Definitely on the bucket list.
The one time I visited Kennedy Space Center as a teenager, only a few years ago, it was all closed off because they were assembling the space shuttle. It was before the space shuttle launch, and you couldn't go into the big assembly building. But they showed us, this is where you stand for this launch, and this is where you'd stand to see that launch. Apparently, it's amazing.
I would absolutely love it.
And the impact. But, you know, I'd be more interested in seeing a space mission that's going to a cool planet to launch than just a bunch of humans. Because they're only going up. Like, how far are they going up? What counts as being in space?
Well, this is what we want to talk about because we have astronauts that we've spoken to who have gone up to the International Space Station. And
okay, that's what, 400 kilometers. Okay, 400 kilometers. That's good spacey.
That's spacey. It's spacey. Right? In terms of astronauts and the title and going into space and how far you go into space, how are we feeling about the recent launches? Well, actually, before we even get into that, has anybody, I'm going to assume that people have watched shuttle launches, or has anybody watched anything beyond that? Anybody experienced watching a Saturn V launch or anything?
I've watched a few Vega.
I'm old enough to have watched the Saturn V launches live, and I still think it's the most astonishing space vehicle in terms of the way it looks. I just think absolutely awesome. It's going to start to become, there's a few competitors on the way, I have to say. So some of the heavy launch vehicles that different countries are building are very impressive. I just think it's almost like the design of it. It's just really a beautiful looking machine when it takes off. I love the main engines start on it, or we weren't called main engines at the time, but that was really a shuttle terminology. And the thing gets held down for a second or two to allow the full 7 million pounds of thrust to build up before it gets released. I just think of imagine the bolts that hold that thing down, because your initial reaction would be to just let it go once the engines go off. So I've seen that. I've seen quite a number of other smaller ones as well. And I just think when you think about the difficulties, the number of ways that a rocket can go, which isn't up, is, large. So the fact that some controlled manner,
it's up or not up.
It's not up or not up. And, a lot of failures early on, and we might come to it later, it's still hair raising because the physics is against you taking that trajectory by default. To do other things more easily, like, for example, bring you back down to the ground in an uncontrolled manner. So a lot of engineering required to do that in the way that we now potentially take for granted. My vote goes to Saturn V.
Okay, but Saturn V, I will defer to your greater experience. I don't have memories of the Saturn V. They're the big honking rockets that take you to the moon, right?
Those guys, yeah.
Going to use a Saturn V to go to the space station because that's only 400 kilometers away. We've not gone anywhere apart from the space station for humans, apart from a handful of missions, including one, I think, just a month or so ago, that went even higher than the space station. So we've not needed humans to be traveling across space. They've all been going to Earth orbit locations or less, all right? And from going, where is space? Different people count it differently, don't they? And different regulations come in. Are you in space? And I sometimes say to school groups when I'm talking to them that, the top of the atmosphere isn't like the ocean. There isn't a place where you can go, okay, I'm wet and now I'm dry, or I'm in the Earth's atmosphere and now I'm in space. There's not a distinction. I love the idea that the atmosphere just gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. And even if you are in space, I'm going to go, the space station is in space, you've still got atmosphere around you because they go under Aurora, which I think is so cool. So
I think they're
not even in space. They've got the Earth's atmosphere next to them.
Right at the outset, I think there's you've hit a nail on the head, but there's something that actually defines the uniqueness about a trajectory, and that is if you go, and we call them ballistic trajectories. So, for example, I'm going to back for a second. Suppose you said, "Can I drive into space?" So suppose
go that way or that way.
Went to 1,000,000 miles that direction, just kept on going higher and higher. Your normal standard car will allow you can drive off. I mean, you float, but assuming you didn't float off the road, you don't need any particular massive amount of energy. You don't need any big rocket engine. You just need to put in enough energy. If you can put that in slowly, you can drive off into space. But most rockets use energy for a small amount of time. So you can get up to a high speed so that when you cut off, you boost for higher up. If those rockets continue to burn for a long, long time, you wouldn't need that big sort of thing, the huge acceleration at the start. So if we take that idea of ballistic, so your engine's cut off, if you go to a certain height, you start to fall back to Earth, but as we sometimes say, you keep missing the Earth. So basically you circle around it. So you are now in orbit. To me, if you keep on missing the Earth as you're falling back, that's a reasonable definition of being in space. It may vary by a couple of kilometers, by the way, depending on a couple of different parameters.
So what's your height? What's your height then?
Then you're in space. Well, that's a good question because I don't actually know at what point your ballistic height takes you around the Earth. But we've certainly seen low Earth orbit satellites, which are just moving in orbit at slightly under 400 kilometers. So I'm guessing around, should know this, but I don't. So say around the 300 kilometers. But I couldn't do that. But the critical thing is this idea, you're right, that links it to the atmosphere is the wrong definition in my view to start.
Okay. Because the atmosphere changes as well. Depending on what the sun is up to, the atmosphere is different. So you can't even use that. So low Earth, we've kind of our low Earth, our middle Earth, and our high Earth orbit, our geostationary way out there. They're all in space. So what if I'm going to space, but I'm not going to go into orbit? I'm just going up and coming back, like a certain Canadian actor, age 90, did just a little while ago. I gotta love William Shatner. Okay. Canadian content is coming here. Gotta love him.
Gotta love him.
But did he go to space? What height did he go? I looked him up. Actually, I looked him up because I got to say I'm a Shatner fan, okay? He went 62 miles. Now, I can't convert miles to kilometers.
Say, Francis.
I think it's about 84 or something kilometers.
84 kilometers, okay. 350,000 feet. What are feet, anyways? Okay, so he went a good bit, okay? He went up. Did he go to space?
It's extremely impressive, but
did he go to space? If he's an astronaut or not, first, did he go to space? And then, I have other thoughts, but did he physically go into the bit of the distance away from the planet where we go, he's in space?
Yeah. So I think the issue is you start to get into people wanting to define things for other reasons. So I'm going back to the physics of it, which is the uniqueness of the going into orbit versus the random heights and random air densities, not random, but relatively arbitrarily selected numbers associated with that. So I think you got to be really impressed with what's been going on this year, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it, because it is really impressive that can be done, and largely by private companies. Yes, a lot of money goes into them, but just think about the technology for a second. We can maybe discuss the other bits and pieces. Should we spend the money on that? And that's always part of a discussion. But from a technology perspective, even in terms of being much more efficient in terms of the amount of fuel you use, there's a lot of impressive stuff going on and a lot of interesting groundwork being set. But there's probably an inevitable PR associated with all of this. I took a very high profile person and I sent them into space. I think it's honest to say you took a very high profile person in an incredibly sophisticated craft, which has proven itself to be really very reliable, and you put them up and you brought them back safely to Earth. Echoes of somebody in 1962, was that the Rice University commentary by J.F. Kennedy. So bringing people up in high and bringing them back down should be the first thing that we concern ourselves with. And I think, in fairness, that's what is the focus of the sort of space tourist industry at the moment. Then we get into that very arbitrary and the badge and deciding who got to space first and so on. You know what? The SpaceX guys didn't mess about. They just went up and they orbited for 3 days. Now that's space. Okay. So we can, in my view, they're astronauts. That's it. No question about it. The others, not so sure. Should one care? I'm not sure we should care. I mean, if we're going to give it, should we be obsessed by being an astronaut? I think the idea of going up, I saw the Shatner comments about how impressed he was by being down there. That's good enough for me. I don't need them to be say that makes me an astronaut. But I think if you want to really get into that, there's vaguenesses and then there's definites. To me, the SpaceX guys, because that was above the International Space Station, that's definitely
okay. I want to do devil's advocate with you on this.
Oh no.
Just okay. I can get on a roller coaster and I can be whizzed up to the top of the roller coaster and whizzed around the roller coaster and taken on everything around and brought back. I did not drive that roller coaster. Inspiration 4, which I think is the one you're talking about, SpaceX, okay? For those who missed it when it happened, and a few people did, it was extremely cool. If you happen to have a billionaire friend who will pay for the flight, and shouldn't we all have been billionaires at 36 by starting up companies and making all that money? He had as his pilot Dr. Sian Proctor, and she had been an unsuccessful astronaut in the final 47 candidates of the 2009 NASA selections. She's somebody who wanted to be an astronaut and wasn't selected for NASA training. But she flew. But if you check it, it was controlled from the ground. She sat in a roller coaster ride. And the roller coaster went to space. and took them around. And at no point were they doing anything but sitting in a roller coaster.
So most of the astronauts in the International Space Station don't drive the space station.
Okay, so they're not astronauts either then, by my reasoning, but I think they are. So where am I going wrong? Because I think you have to do more than sit in a roller coaster.
No,
this was part of, sorry to cut across you, but like, this was part of my whole thing in the beginning was when I was watching this going, you're not, if you're not driving the plane, you're not flying the plane, you're not the pilot. Like I fly to the US all the time. I'm not a pilot, I'm just a passenger. And that was it. And then looking into how the definitions have changed from NASA, until 1965, they were only choosing pilots. So they were taking fighter pilots, they were coming straight out of the Army and Embry-Riddle and all this and straight into the NASA, the astronaut program. It's because not even that they wanted them to fly, it was more of the skill set that they were able to handle intense situations and they would be able to handle. So it wasn't even the flying ability, because that was what I was really resting my whole argument on was it's that they can fly the thing, but it wasn't even that. It's that they can handle stressful situations, which they did. And then you have the shuttle, actually I'm thinking Harrison Schmitt went up. That wasn't shuttle, that was still Saturn V, wasn't that would have been Apollo. So
17, I think, yeah.
He wasn't a pilot. He's a geologist. So even during the Apollo era, they were taking up scientists and engineers and people with medical backgrounds who were not pilots and had pilots.
Okay, so if the job you do doesn't matter, then it's back down to what height you went. And if you go up high enough that the world looks blue and small below you and space is black above you, you are an astronaut.
So, I mean, when you're watching...
You're telling me it doesn't matter the job.
If you're watching the Blue Origin flights, they really focus on the heights, like you're talking about. They really focus on that. And they show... They have a nice, beautiful graphic on the side, actually, when you're watching it.
Sure, yeah.
And once they hit that Kármán line, they get all excited.
There you go. So because your job doesn't matter. You've convinced me the job doesn't matter. Because people have space to do jobs in space, it doesn't matter if you're flying the ship. Because not everybody gets to fly the ship. You know, you're going to be a passenger, but you're still going to space to do something. So it's the height that matters, not the job. And William Shatner is an astronaut.
I think the thing for me now is to do something.
Okay, so on one of Richard Branson's flights, they took science experiments with them, and in their short, little tiny flight, when they went up and came down, they did science. So if you do some science, but what, I mean, Niall, you mentioned...
Just a comment. But nobody went, only the SpaceX team went into orbit. The others didn't. Kármán line is...
Okay, so you saying that only if you went into orbit...
The Kármán line is there largely because you have some transfer of regulation between civil airspace and something else. So in order to define, aircraft that would fly under 100 kilometers, because that would seem to be so high that it wouldn't impose any difficulties with somebody saying, well, actually, I was above civil airspace, so civil aviation rules don't apply to me. So you put it at 100 kilometers. So above that, then different rules apply. But
does it have to do with lift?
No, it is really no good.
I thought it was to do with the atmosphere is so thin that you don't get lift, so you're not flying the same way.
No, you can.
Probably.
You put big enough wings, you'll get lifts.
So, big wings, love it. Okay, so big wings, we can fly to space, and you've told me we can do it for low energy.
The fundamental thing is going into orbit, and this is the fundamental physics difference. That's another.
Okay, so Yuri Gagarin, first human in space, he went into orbit.
Yep.
First American, did he go into orbit? Didn't he just go up and down?
This is the thing with John Glenn. He actually ended up getting astronauts.
No, he's not an astronaut according to Niall's criteria because he didn't go into orbit.
They actually changed the...
Yeah, well, I'm not going to disagree with me. I mean, I'm not handing out the astronaut badges. Well, there's one call it that. That's a separate discussion. You can see why, though. That goes back to what we discussed earlier about the PR and the rationale for saying somebody is. My bar of chocolate. That's fine. But we need a more mature view. Well, we need two things. We can say, if you go above 100 kilometers, we're just going to call you an astronaut and just all agree with it and move on.
Yeah.
I think from a Blackrock Castle Observatory, a part of what we're pointing out today is that's arbitrary. There's nothing magic about going to 100 kilometers and 1 centimeter. There's nothing special happens. There's no new physics. There's no new chemistry. There's nothing. You don't see something amazingly different. You just gone time a bit higher. Orbit has one fundamental difference, is that you are in free fall and you don't come back to Earth. You will eventually, because atmospheric drag and so forth. But that to me seems to be something that's definitely a bit different to just going up above sort of an arbitrary line, even if you're just sitting there as a passenger.
Okay, so can I just give you a quote from one of the media outlets reporting on William Shatner going to space? Quote, I had to write this down because I just loved it. I just like your reaction. The media said they were far enough from the edge of space to experience weightlessness.
Yeah.
Far enough from the edge of space.
Far enough from the edge of space to experience weightlessness. I think they've missed the point.
I'm just working on the sentence. So
I saw that. I mean, just saying, you know, if any of our viewers have not seen the William Shatner response to being in space, Niall, you mentioned it, that his response alone would be enough to justify sending him to space as an astronaut. He came back overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Was it yesterday, Francis? Was Carl Sagan's birthday?
Yeah, Carl Sagan's birthday was yesterday.
Carl
Yes.
Sagan. One of my favorite movies is Contact, written by Carl Sagan, and just absolutely astonishing line in it where she's just overwhelmed with what she sees, and she says they should have sent a poet. And I think that's the benefit of being non-technical people. That's what William Shatner did bring. Like, I've spoken to a lot of astronauts, and I've been lucky to speak to a lot of astronauts as part of working with BCO. But I think they're often very highly trained individuals who have, I won't say rehearsed their lines, but I think they've learned to appear slightly underwhelmed by their experience, just for functional purposes. To have somebody go up and come back down and be overwhelmed like that,
Yes,
is something that we should be able to do more often, because that's the kind of person who will help people see the value of it. Now, I'm also a huge Star Trek fan, so I was delighted that William Shatner went to space. But everybody keeps saying, oh, William Shatner is the first Star Trek actor to go to space. He's not. Mae Jemison went to space before as an astronaut and came back and then starred in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So she just went about it airspace, but she still managed to do it.
yeah, yeah.
The other thing that I think is important is that we were able to symbolically at least address some injustices of the past, such as bringing Wally Funk up. Like, as part of the Mercury 13, I think there was an awful lot of women on that program who deserved to go to space every bit as much as the men did. And while we can debate whether or not she's an astronaut, I am still very, very happy that we were able to send Wally Funk to space at the very least.
I think everybody here would agree, like, even though she was not given her astronaut title originally, that now she is definitely deserving of it. And she was deserving of it to begin with, but her going into space makes complete sense. And for me, hands down, there's no debate there. She's definitely an astronaut. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not too concerned about where the edge of space is and whether getting into space makes you an astronaut. I think it's more, I guess, your training or what you do while you're up there. Because as Francis mentioned, you're basically cargo in some instances. I mean, is Laika an astronaut? You know, the first dog we shot into space. Why not? Like as you said, Danielle, it's astro and not. It's a sailor of the stars, and effectively he did as much up there as a lot of these passengers did. I mean, if anything, he did more because he did some scientific experiments. He answered some questions for us. You know, like the geckos, any of these animals we're sending up, do we have to call them astronauts too?
Yeah, poor old Laika. But that we might the sad end of Laika.
I was like, I don't know.
We on that point, Rob. I mean, we're all, without sounding trite about it, we're all astronauts anyway, because we're all star voyagers. We're all on this ball moving at 18 kilometers per second around the sun, for example.
I think there's a song about it.
There is. Monty Python had it spot on. So we are all moving through space all the time, and we're our particular. And I know we all hear the word spaceship Earth, and we you can kind of trip up the tongue, but actually, when you think about it, it really is our spaceship, and it is a craft that's moving through space, and it is in orbit around its own star, and then that particular star is in orbit, in a complex orbit within its own galaxy, and that galaxy then has orbits within the local group of galaxies, and so on. And so, in that sense, I think when we go out tonight, even as we've been having this conversation, we have been moving through space. The stars above us have been moving relative to us. They may, of course, appear fixed, but they're really not. There's a lot of activity just goes in general over larger timescales. So I think we can all put a little pat on the back and say we are all astronauts. Some are just different types. It's another and
it didn't cost me millions.
And it didn't cost you millions or billions, indeed.
I think the thing with the term astronaut, like I personally feel that sometimes as scientists we can be a little bit over pedantic, and but that's not always the case. So for instance, my background before working here was actually in zoology. And one of the areas that we get very pedantic about is the difference between poisonous or venomous. If you eat something, it's poisonous. If it bites you and you get envenomated, it's venomous. But if I get bitten by a rattlesnake and I go to the ER and I tell them I was bitten by a poisonous snake, the doctor is going to know what to do. He's not going to say, "Did you eat it?" That level of pedantry functionally doesn't really have an impact on how we live our lives. I do think that the term astronaut, though, needs to have some kind of weight attached to it if we're going forward, because I think the potential for the damage to be done, if the term is, if the weight is removed from it, it could be irrefutable. Like I started blogging back when blogs were a big thing, and there was a big problem at that time where every Tom, Dick, and Harry who started a blog called themselves a journalist. Now they're not subject to the same journalistic standards that actual practice journalists are, but people didn't really call it out to the same extent. And I think we would all agree that in recent years there have been some failures of journalism that have caused real problems, and people feel like people have been dropping the ball, repeating the wrong lines, and promoting conspiracy theories because they'll sell newspapers. That's the kind of thing that can happen if you don't draw a line in the sand and say, no, this is the person with the expertise. These are the people that we need to listen to. My biggest worry with the private sector isn't so much that these people are bringing people into space. It's that if it goes wrong, and they're not necessarily subject to the same safety standards as, let's say, at NASA are, if it goes wrong, I don't think the public will be able to differentiate as readily as we might hope the difference between NASA sending somebody up and, let's say, a Jeff Bezos sending somebody up, and it might dissuade them from space exploration just in general. Because we know that did happen. There was a public shift in perception after a few of the major accidents that happened as part of the shuttle program. I would just hate to see that happen again, because I do think space exploration is important, and I think protecting the public support for that is also important.
But I wonder, Rob, are we moving into a different era in the following sense? We all know there's sadly fatalities, car crashes every day, but we kind of say, look, there's a lot of people, we're going to accept some consequence. Not accept is maybe the wrong word, but just for the purpose of this, I can't think maybe a better word. But it is part of the risk that we allow into the way we structure our societies. That, like when NASA was putting up the shuttle, there was very much this sense that this was a national emblem and it couldn't go wrong. This was the right stuff. This was the best technology, some of the best minds on the planet. Are we moving into an era where people are kind of, a bit like when you go on the bouncy castle and you say, well, you're right, well, I might get injured here, but I'm writing away my rights to sue you, because you just accept that now going into space is dangerous. Some people aren't going to come back, and that's just going to be the way it is. I'm not being trying to be trite about it. People's lives are incredibly important, but I just wonder, will we start to see just, that drift, so that we have less concern, every year, say 500 people go into space and 10 people die, for example, and we just say, well, that's accepted. That's what you do when you go to space. I just wonder, will our view on accessing space also evolve as we just say that, well, it's people are taking their own risk into their own hand, and if it fails, then they knew the risk they were taking. But it's a private decision, and companies that fail a lot shouldn't be given.
If we said 500 people take a roller coaster and 10 people die, the roller coasters would be shut down.
That's a fair point.
Because you're a passenger.
And what you've mentioned there, Niall, basically driving versus the roller coaster, I think is where the perception could come down to. Like, I think some of these more recent launches feel a bit like vanity projects to some people. They don't see the same scientific merit. Where some of them, like, I'm not going to name names because I don't feel like getting sued by anybody in particular or anything, but some of them are actively helping the public space sector. They are helping to bring craft to the International Space Station, and they do have genuine merit that benefits all of us. Some people might feel that that's not the case with all of them. And if, an expensive roller coaster blows up and kills people, public perception probably won't be as forgiving as if somebody is going up to bring supplies to the space station and a tragedy happens. And I think, as you say, the car thing is one of those things. We have accepted that cars are a realistic part of life. We're never going to get rid of cars to, get rid of the fatalities. But at the same time, we'll put seatbelts and airbags in as these technologies evolve. And I think that's an important step that we need to start taking very, very quickly. Because one of the recent launches, people did elect to ignore some safety warnings. And it caused some investigations, etc. And again, I just don't, I could be completely wrong, but my biggest worry, because I don't worry about somebody who takes a risk and says, I am willing to take that risk, I'm going up. I fully respect that that's a choice somebody can make. I am mostly worried that if there is an accident, it will harm public support for more worthy endeavors.
I think for having a little bit of background in aviation is that I see the space industry right now very much like how the aviation industry progressed. And it was initially we weren't having as many flights going. It was very expensive. It was for the wealthy. And so I kind of see that being the same kind of way now. But then also you look at flights, and because we've had such a history with aircraft and technology has advanced, and because the regulations are so strict, we have very few crashes. And so I think where like with cars, there's crashes all the time. I think that I would hope that the aviation industry and the space industry are very similar in that way, that there will be constant regulation. Hopefully, it's difficult when we're doing private industry because the government really is the one that puts those sort of regulations in place and makes sure that those are taken care of, because you don't get onto a flight without an engineer signing off on every single flight before it takes off and all the safety checks are done. That doesn't happen every time you get in your car. You don't check every single thing and have somebody sign off on it. So I would hope that it's the same way going forward with rockets, because you are dealing with lives, and it is much more expensive when a rocket blows up than when your car crashes, and the loss of life, of course, as well. But I've had a bit of discussion with Rob about this. So I'm a little bit torn, because I feel like privatizing the space industry will make it more accessible, which I think is fantastic. We're sending more people into space. My worry is that it'll water down the title astronaut, because everybody will be like, well, now I've been to space, I've been an astronaut. But at the same time, I think it will make it cheaper, and will hopefully we'll have more people being able to experience what it's like going out and actually being able to see the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, the glow of the atmosphere, all of that sort of thing, the blackness of space. I'd love to be able to see that kind of thing. But I also, I was saying to Francis earlier, I don't want to go up right now. I'll wait till they've done it a few more times.
I'm feet firmly on the ground. People ask me, would you want to go to space? No, I'm in space. I want to look at space. I want to understand space. And my feet are staying here on the ground. People, right now, the European Space Agency is recruiting the next astronaut class. They had over 20,000 applicants for probably 4, 5, maybe 6 places. There's a lot of people who want to be astronauts and who don't have a spare few million or a friendly billionaire for a private. And they will get their opportunity. They're undergoing their tests right now. They're undergoing interviews. And the process is happening now for the next set of astronauts from Europe. I'm actually more interested because I'm with if you go above 50 miles, you're an astronaut. You've gone into space, that's it, you're an astronaut. I'm interested in the analog astronauts because I think the astronauts who are going to go to Mars aren't going to do it. First run will get everything right. So there are analogs happening now looking at the human dynamics and how you work and engage with people over a long period of time. So there's a recent new bunch locked up away for, it's a mixed, isn't it? It's the first mixed crew, male and female, 6 people, different countries, are going to lock themselves away and see, do they not kill each other? Okay. They haven't gone to space, so they're not astronauts, but they're advancing the astronaut program way more than people going into, I mean, sorry, William, you went to space, you're an astronaut, and you haven't done anything to advance astronaut knowledge and astronaut understanding. Although I do like what he said. So maybe
this is my question.
Because he talked about it so well.
Do we have to, and for the aviation thing, pilots were always pilots from the beginning. And when aviation was first becoming more commercialized, pilots were rock stars. You know, it was like, oh my God, there's a pilot. Or if somebody knew a pilot, oh, and so-and-so is a pilot. That was really impressive. And there's still, it's a bit of prestige with that career as well, but it's not what it used to be. So do we see that this will happen with astronauts? It'll be like, oh yeah, that guy just flies to space every day.
So what are we at? 600-ish now. So when we're at 1,000, like, is there
even more
perceive that we'll go, there's another astronaut.
But surely that's where we want to get to. Surely what we want to say that as a species that is intelligent, that we will make it so that it's easy for us to be off planet and have mechanisms which allow us to perform as we normally do. And here's the thing. Let's just think about what we're doing here today. And the complexity of the way we're communicating, the complexity of our bodies. You know, we can do anything. Somebody mentioned it earlier, Rob, was you about when you talk about the sort of the venom and so on. Like when you talk of things, I remember early on, and now this is going back admittedly a few years, but I was going to show something with the pen. I've decided to change my mind on that. Was to do it. If you say to a computer, something about sit on the chair. Or if I say to you, sit on the chair, you know what that means. I don't have to say, walk over there 3 steps, turn left, and so on. So there's a huge amount, as we know, of this kind of processing that goes on. So even when you say we're kind of in a way a passenger, and I agree, by the way, with a lot of those comments, we're an unbelievably sophisticated passenger. The simple part of what's in that system is the technology. Even though we marvel at the technology relative to what's sitting inside, it's very simple. So I think the badge of honor should be that if any of us 90 years old or 2 years old or 110 years old want to go to space, in a number of years, our aspiration should be for that to be done in an environmentally sustainable way, in a way that has a zero carbon footprint, ideally that sequesters carbon on the way up, actually absorbs carbon from the atmosphere as it does that allows people to go up and do something potentially useful, whether that's enjoy themselves, health and well-being, or whether that's actually do something to do with space mining, whatever it might be. Whatever we do on Earth, translate that into opportunities in space. At the moment, of course, we're concerned that doing that damages back only for rich people. And you're right, Daniel, that's an inevitable, it seems to me, transition period. Is it inevitable that we come out of that and happiness? Not necessarily, maybe we don't. But for me, that's where we should be trying to go. We should have encouraged young people to think that as you're going through the atmosphere and as you're building, there's a very interesting rocket that's been launched by, it's a launch with a Finnish company and the European Space Agency, and the satellite is made out of Finnish hardware. Now, obviously, the electronics can't be made out of wood, but the body of it is. And the idea is kind of that we start to look at a whole different way of making spacecraft. And so for me, that's when we talk about astronauts and so on. And I agree with Francis, we can get caught up completely in a definition of something, or we can actually say, well, how do we, if we think it would be really exciting, we want to do it safely, then let's work out a way to overcome those problems. That, I think, when we do at BCO, we can help to excite the next generation of young people. By the way, older people as well, if they've got a good idea, let's put them all into that pot right at the minute. So I think we're in a really interesting transition. And as a last comment on this, before, if you weren't amazing, then you weren't going to be an astronaut. If you weren't amazing, you weren't going to be a rocket scientist. If you weren't amazing, you were never going to be part of this human endeavor. And I think it's exciting that we're moving towards, if you're competent, if you're good, if you're qualified, you have a role, an important role to play, be part of it. I think that's beginning to bleed. I wouldn't say if you go and talk to everybody, they'd say, oh yeah, absolutely, that's where we're at the moment. But I think that you're starting to see it. You're seeing more companies getting involved in space. You're seeing more people who said, I never gave any thought to space, but now I'm doing bits and pieces, and my company makes this, which happened to end up on the International Space Station. So I think there's that narrative is changing. I think it makes it exciting. So I would like to see that if we look back at this in 20 years' time, we'd be saying, do you remember we were arguing about being an astronaut? Right? But now it's relatively commonplace, and we've. Do you remember in one of the things in Starter was the transparent aluminum? This was one of the big steps forward, was being able to make transparent. Of course, the Americans. The terminology aluminum. So this idea, because aluminium isn't transparent, but you make it, and this was apparently very important because you could make windows that could travel at close to the speed of light, or indeed beyond the speed of light. Now let's not go into that, but and that didn't get damaged because they were made of aluminum, but they were transparent. So that's a bit of a kind of a sci-fi jump forward, but we know we're all using phones that when we look back at Star Trek, this wouldn't have looked out of place in a Star Trek. And they said, come on, guys, that phone does more than you're going to be able to do. So I would like to think that we're going to see those massive changes. And the great thing about the likes, and I have been a little bit critical. I hope not too critical about some of the private things. I'm a fundamental believer that we need to give people that opportunity to try to solve them. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of reasons they do it, which aren't all for pure goodness. But I think it'll help the advancement overall. Anyway, so put people in a tin can or whatever can it might be, transparent aluminum, as possible and as many as possible. And let's get away from having to have this big bang that takes you off at 9G or something like that to get you to space, and do it gently so that anybody can go. That for me would be real success. And I think it's going to happen because there's no physics to fundamentally stop us taking that approach. It's a technology barrier that we have at the minute.
Is there a need?
I didn't make it into space, by the way. So I didn't make it as an astronaut. I put my name down to become an astronaut when Ireland was looking for one many years ago. Didn't make it. And so I want a second bite of the cherry. It may be when I'm 90. So I need these technologies to be safe and sorted. And there's a few years to go, but not as many as there used to be. So if you're watching, sort out the problem.
Is there a need, though, to protect the term? And if we're going to be having all different people from different, like we talk about this a lot, that in space where there is a need for all different types of people with different backgrounds and different skill sets. So if we have, which we already do have, doctors and scientists and attempted teachers go to space, different people with different skill sets going in, then we have a term for astronaut that is what we generally think of an astronaut as now, and then the thousands of other different types of people going into space would be like a lawyer, for example. We have space lawyers. And if a lawyer goes into space, are they then an astronaut, or is this now an astro lawyer, or do we have some other term to come up that we have for other people?
I would agree that, like, with Niall, 100% that we want to get to a place where it is commonplace and no big deal. Like you said, if I've been on a plane, I don't go around telling people, hey, I'm a former plane passenger. You know, it's just not a big deal. But I think to get to that stage, we need to be careful enough and protect it. So I don't think we've come over the hump yet. I think we are still in a place where we do need to do something like what you said. And I don't have a very hard and fast definition of what I think an astronaut is. And if you ask me, Rob, what should an astronaut be? I would say equivalent to, you mentioned pilots. If the pilot knocked himself out and you went back into the passenger to go, is anybody here a pilot? I want the equivalent level of competency of whoever puts up their hand. And it's not going to be somebody that was a passenger. Like, well, I've flown a few planes before in the back, so I know what I'm doing. But, you know, if it's somebody who's flown, you know, a few times with a smaller jet, it's still not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. I want the guy who has flown in the smaller aircraft rather than the passenger who's been on a load of flights. Sure. I want the same for my astronauts. If I'm heading up and something goes wrong, I want, you know, the guy who's got training from NASA. No, William Shatner isn't saving my life up there.
No, I gotta say, Rob, no, I disagree with you completely.
What, you're just gonna let the plane crash? Is that what you're gonna do?
The restricting it to people who have certain particular technical skills. There's multiple skills. We work as teams. We're not individuals. There's too much of this pioneer spirit, and we're launching off. A lot of the language is around this, you know, exceptional launching and discovery and the rugged individual doing stuff. We're teams. We work together as teams. I'm not going to say that only if you have the same qualifications and skills as other people do you get to be an astronaut. No, I am part of Team Astronaut, and I do this part of the team job, and I'm good for this. And, you know, yes, there'll be somebody else. Have another backup, possibly, but on my 4-member crew, we don't all duplicate each other's skills. That's a waste of our time. It's a waste of our training. But if you go up, and I'm going to go with the 50-mile, 80-kilometer mark, you know, enough that it's blue and black, you're an astronaut.
I think that's fine when you have small numbers, but like Niall was saying, we have thousands of people going off to
sure.
weekends.
Excellent.
Is every single one of them an astronaut?
Fabulous. Yes.
I think it's really important in a conversation like this to have disagreements. And I'm going to disagree with Francis. Utterly random. I'm an astronaut if I do that. So there you go. It's. But yeah, look. But isn't this why we've heard recently as well comments by about let's solve the problems on Earth. Let's not go into space. And I understand the concerns as well. In my experience, it's really important to get, unless situations are utterly catastrophic, motivating, encouraging, exciting people normally gives you a good return. And I think by showing what's possible, like this is always a dangerous one, because we've talked about this before in other fora. It's very easy for the likes of me sitting here, and I'm going to kind of use the same time with a full belly. I'm going to go home to a warm house. I'm going to watch my telly, my 7,000 different channels that I want. I can record fast. I'm very aware how privileged I am, and anything I say is from the perspective of somebody's privilege. And I can let on that I can see other people's perspective, but I can't. I know I can't because I'm not in their shoes. That said, it does seem to me that to encourage people to push themselves and to motivate themselves, that this type of building these devices in a way that could be more, allow more access. So you're now changing the narrative to be, let's have these 90-year-old people going up into space. I mean, like 10 years ago, if you said a 90-year-old, in fact, ESA won't let you if you're above 55. Is that the limit, I think, on ESA at the moment? I think if you want to apply for the program at the moment, it's 55. I know that I'm not eligible.
I'm too old. Oh,
no. And I can understand that, by the way. But I should just clarify, here's the reason why ESA do that. They do 2 years of finding out. They spend 7 years potentially training you. They want to get maybe 10 years of use out of you. You look at the average life expectancy, of 80-ish. You can kind of start to see why, if you start training somebody at 90 with average life expectancies, it's unlikely that they will go through that rigorous training process. So I completely understand why there would be a cutoff for become an ESA astronaut. But in terms of going into space, I think the excitement generated and the controversy, I would like to think you'll see a bit like with the Apollo mission, next generation of engineers and scientists who will then solve other problems that either directly related to Earth, or obviously if you go up into space more effectively, you can potentially have satellites that do more Earth more usefully. I mean, a lot of what we know about global warming, I think it's an obvious statement, but it's because we can see it from above, from satellites built by different countries, flying in different orbits. You aggregate what they say, they all say the same thing, the temperature rising, there's no hiding place. So I think by having lots of different actors on lots of different parts of the planet, it's a bit like journalists coming, being able to question and so on. The more people we get involved in this, the more likelihood is I think that we'll make advances. But of course you can make the argument, well, we should maybe wait 10, 20 years to make those advances and actually focus on curing more immediate things. I understand the two sides, but I think there's people there who fundamentally are scientists and engineers because this is what drives them. And again, I say that from the perspective of somebody who is very privileged in a very small percentage of the world's population to have the life I have. So, it's a really tricky one to be able to comment on.
So well said, Niall. I agree with much of what you said, apart from the beginning when you disagreed with me. But
I'm very brave. I must be at a distance here.
I do have a question in the comments from Colum here, and it's a really good question, which we could talk about forever. So let's not try to go on for too long. But do you guys think that SpaceX are really the only game in town at the moment for pushing the envelope for access to space, given what they've done so far with Falcon and rapid Starship developments?
Well, I'll start because I left a pause there. If not the only game in town, they're absolutely streets ahead of everybody else, from what I can see. And I have no vested interest one way or the other. To me, if you connect with the International Space Station, and if you're allowed to do that, there's a huge amount of the reliability of your spacecraft in the first instance, because the International Space Station is the most expensive experiment ever assembled, over $100 billion at this stage. To be able to slowly crash into that, or dock, as we might say, is hugely a huge vote of confidence. The SpaceX's, they've had their failures of their rockets, absolutely. But what it seems is their roadmap for developing it is well considered, it's well funded. They seem to have got the types of individuals who you require to solve the problems. And as a final comment on, they have already launched a very usable, if still somewhat limited, network of low energy, low Earth orbit broadband, which we can some of us here have seen their Starlink in operation in Ireland. We've used ones here. I was talking to a guy yesterday, and he was in Spain, and he was connecting to me via his Starlink link. So I'm starting to find people using that type of technology, and that's all SpaceX. So I have to say, you have to be impressed by them. I actually don't mind who wins. To me, it's just like, I'm glad there's BMWs and Fiats and Hyundais. Bring it on. Whoever is better, that's great. That's the competition. But at the moment, SpaceX, it seems to me, is very aggressive in terms of performance. And maybe they'll be like VHS and Betamax. For those of you who are young, that'll mean nothing. But maybe somebody will come up and disrupt them, and they'll fall into second place. But at the moment, I think it's very impressive and very encouraging for the future of space. A company of that exists and is able to harness human intellect the way they've done. I'm encouraged by it, and I own no shares in SpaceX. So,
I mean, I would say that I'm this is no secret, I'm not the biggest fan of space capitalists, but even with that caveat, I have to acknowledge that in terms of just the competency of what they were able to deliver, SpaceX are miles ahead of the competition. It's not necessarily the mode of how, getting out there that I would personally advocate necessarily, but there's no question that they're miles ahead of the competition in terms of what they deliver.
And Francis, you were talking about the SpaceX astronauts earlier, I think at the beginning.
Yeah, the inspiration for the other companies are taking you up and bringing you down. SpaceX is saying, oh, hey, fellow billionaire, you want to pay for a whole flight for 3 days for 4 days? Oh, well, because you're not going to be docking that, and they dock, don't they, rather than berth. There's a difference with pulled in or whether you go in under your own speed. You're not going to dock with the ISS. Let's replace the front airlock with a window. Like, they've got this approach, which is a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more involved. And yeah, but again, it's the multi-billionaires doing it. SpaceX at least are looking at commercial spaceflight and working with NASA and working with other agencies. They took our European astronaut, Thomas Pesquet, up to the space station, brought him back safely. So they are one of the ways to get to space, which the others are not there. You can get to space, but you're going to come back down again in the same ship. You want to be a passenger? They're the people you can be a passenger with. That's interesting to see that that's now happening. And because for so many years, there was just your 3 seats on a Soyuz, which itself didn't always go wonderfully, And if we think back to those very first space tourists, do they count astronauts? Yeah, for sure. Those handful of people who paid millions.
And it's Tito, wasn't he one of the first, if memory correctly?
Yeah. Millions for the spare seat on the Soyuz, and went up to the space station and did work at the space station and came back as tourists. I think it's interesting. The Cyan Proctor, her Wikipedia page calls her a space flight participant, which I'm feeling it big way. Space flight participant. I hate that. Call her an astronaut.
Oh my God. I'm not sure how you feel about it, Francis. Really wavering.
I'll just say it again. I hate it.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me as well, it's probably, we're at an interesting moment that because a lot of what is visible is the billionaire side of things, we forget there's an entire space industry which is supporting fundamental operations on the planet, fundamental information. A lot, part of what we're doing here, for all we know, might be going through satellite links. It's a possibility. Certainly, if you're talking to abroad, you might have some part of your thing going through satellite links. A lot of your TV, could argue whether that's good, bad, or different, but TV has had enormous impact on our culture. A lot of that wouldn't have been possible without geostationary satellites, and increasingly we're seeing low Earth orbit satellites. And they don't have astronauts in them per se, because they're too small and they're not. There's no intention of, they're all purely autonomous vehicles. But it's getting that. If we need astronauts to excite people and get them thinking about space, well, other than some of the really good stuff that's going on with astronauts, a lot of good stuff going on at the International Space Station, which we didn't get a chance to stop at today because that wasn't the purpose of today's chat. So we're not forgetting them. They're just not part of today's particular chat. But, there's a lot of that inspiration is going to be important when people are building these smaller devices, which are still then going to do things that have immediate and direct impact on those of us on the Earth, including, really importantly, in some of the more underdeveloped and underrepresented areas of the world. Because satellites fly over Ireland and they fly over poor countries that are significantly poorer than us equally well. There's no differentiation in terms of the orbital difficulty. So, being in space gives us massive opportunities. I would hope that we don't wrap the billionaire argument into suppressing any desire to use space for the advantages of all. And I think that might be a Star Trek-y type comment, actually. So that would be disappointing if the narrative moved in that direction, because I think once you're talking about astronauts and people are big and heavy objects, relatively speaking. So it's always going to be expensive for the foreseeable future to put people into space. And always be the question of what they do when they get there versus a robot, for example. So that's always going to be a discussion at the minute. But I think it's also an inspiration for others to try to solve those problems. And just imagine if in this 20 years time, we're saying, yeah, there was those really interesting developments in the technology that allows us to put people in space now relatively straightforwardly. That would be fantastic. Not because necessarily we'll put a lot of people into space, but we'll have the option of doing it. And options are good. It's always good to have the option. It's when you don't that that you have to worry. And humans are good at introducing options. So I think it's an exciting time. But as Rob points out, it's also a kind of a time it could away because climate change is a big challenge. But how we solve it is really complicated, and it's not going away in 10 years, or 20 years, unfortunately, or 30 years. So if astronauts today can inspire kids of tomorrow who might solve some of the problems directly, either through satellite technology or directly on Earth, that's a good thing. We'll need to keep inspiring our young. We can't say that job is done now. We can't afford to go to space. We got to inspire them other ways. Space has a role to play in inspiring, and that itself will be really important to see from ourselves and the whole climate change thing. So any argument is simple is by definition simple, and we should be skeptical of it. So anybody who says let's not go to space, just stay on the planet and solve the problems here, it's too simple.
Niall, you can go for me.
I'll go for you. Okay. I'll this t-shirt.
Well, we are coming up on the hour here, so I just wanted to kind of wrap this up and maybe anyone give you an opportunity to have your final thoughts on this topic. It's a big, complicated topic. I think there's a lot. I think it's a very interesting time to be having this discussion because we're right in the middle of the rebirth of the excitement of the space industry from when I remember me as a kid growing up with all of the shuttle things shutting down. It kind of just went in the US, and it was kind of that, like we talked about earlier, why are we spending so much money up there when we have all these problems down here? Suddenly there's this life again. And I think for me, part of it is seeing people going into space. It's not, well, I understand the importance of satellites, believe me, I do. And then all the robots and everything else going out into space, they don't have stories to tell. They don't come back and say, oh my God, you should have seen how amazing the Earth looked today, So for me, I think what is making it so exciting is that it's people going out. People are irreplaceable. A robot blows up on a launch pad, you build another one. If people go out, it's a different story. So we're invested in these stories. And I think the importance for me, while I don't agree, sorry, Francis, that William Shatner is an astronaut, I think he had a very important role. Like Rob was saying, we should send a poet because aside from the rudeness of Mr. Jeffrey, when he was like, let me grab that champagne bottle, we were talking about this amazing experience you've been having. I think if you listen to Shatner while he's talking about his experience coming back, I don't think that was him acting. I hope it wasn't anyways. He's a terrible actor to begin with. You heard it here first. My mother will appreciate that comment. I honestly do think that was his heartfelt experience. I really do think that he was affected by what he saw. And I think that is the most important thing about having space tourists go up to space. So just want to any final words for anybody else before we head out on this topic? Is your last thing about?
I'm outvoted. It's a shame my colleagues are all wrong. They're all astronauts. You go to space, doesn't matter for how little time or what you do when you're there, you're an astronaut.
In the interest of balance, I'm going to counter what Daniel said and say that William Shatner is an amazing actor and does not prosper. But what I have enjoyed about this is, like, I went into this thinking we'd all have relatively similar opinions, and to be honest, we do. But even within those similar opinions, there's quite a bit of, divergence, and it's heated, but it's interesting. But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of other perspectives out there that I'd love to hear. So there's people out there with very different experiences. As Niall said, we're all quite privileged here. I'd love to hear what other people think. And I know that Science Foundation Ireland are interested in hearing from people, and the government of Ireland indeed via the Creating Our Futures initiative. And I know Danielle will tell you a little bit more about that as we wrap up. But I would just really encourage you to submit your opinion. It's really important that everybody does have a say.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I'll just piggyback right off of that then. If you were inspired by anything here in this talk and you feel like this is something that Ireland should be investing in, we do have researchers out there in Ireland working on things, and they want to know what they should be focusing on from the public. So if you go to creatingourfutures.ie, creating our future, no S, I keep putting it, creatingourfuture.ie, you can submit your ideas there and have your voice be heard if you think we should be focusing on, could be anything. Could be space, but it could be anything, whatever you think is important and what you think Ireland should be focusing on. Go check out that website. Niall, did you want to have a few words before we wrap up here?
Just to say, totally agree. What we'd really love, what we hope, obviously you've enjoyed maybe being frustrated by some of the things we've been talking about. That's good, because then that means that you have a different view. And creating our future.ie, it's an opportunity only until the end of November. So there's another sort of 3 weeks to go. To capture any thoughts you have about anything that you think might be important for your future, and then whether Ireland and researchers in Ireland can then take that information and try to solve those problems or take advantage of those opportunities for you. So it's a once in a generation opportunity. In fact, it's never been done before in an Irish context. So who knows when it might be done again. So please submit your thoughts. As Danielle says, it could be on space, it could be on anything else. And that will help to influence the future. If you don't submit, then we can't know and can't act on it. So if there's anything that's far about anything, and whether you agree or disagree, there's no right or wrong from the point of view of submitting to creating our future.ie. So please do that.
Perfect. All right. Well, I had a great time. I hope you guys did too. This is one of my favorite chats so far. It was a lot of fun, quite entertaining. I'm not sure we actually decided if people are astronauts or not, but I will say this. In the United States, the FAA are the ones who decide who is officially an astronaut. So you can't just go into space, go above the Kármán line, get your wings that were made by a company and you're an astronaut. You have to actually get them from the FAA. Sorry, Francis, I'm sorry. That's the rules over there.
I said no. He's talking to me. He says William Shatner is not an astronaut. Sorry.
Well, I had a great time, guys, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks for the comments, and I hope everyone else out there had a good time and learned something today. And if you want to carry on the conversation and let us know your opinions, you can always follow us over on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. We're on there as well at the Black Rock Castle Observatory. You can find us on social media. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see